The sun hung like a merciless white disk in the Afghan sky, its rays turning the tarmac of forward operating base Shank into a shimmering mirage of heat waves. At 13:47 hours, the temperature gauge outside the operations tent read 127 degrees Fahrenheit, another typical Tuesday in Paktika province. Staff Sergeant Maria Elena Gonzalez pulled her desert camouflage cap lower over her dark eyes as she approached the massive UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter that sat waiting like a sleeping metal giant on the concrete pad. Her combat boots, worn thin from 8 months of deployment, crunched against the sand-covered tarmac with each purposeful step. Maria had made this walk 847 times since arriving in Afghanistan. She kept count in a small notebook her grandmother had given her before deployment, marking each successful fuel operation with a tiny cross. Today would be number 848. The Black Hawk's rotors drooped in the still air, and its olive drab paint job, or the scars of desert service small nicks from flying debris, a patina of dust that never quite washed clean, and a faded serial. Numbers that told stories of countless missions over hostile territory. The aircraft belonged to the 159th Combat Aviation Brigade, and Maria knew its crew by name. Chief Warrant Officer Rodriguez, the pilot who kept photos of his twin daughters taped to his instrument panel. Specialist Jackson, the door gunner from Alabama who collected postcards from every base he'd served at. And Staff Sergeant Kim, the crew chief who could fix anything that flew and had saved more lives than she cared to count. Today's crew waited in whatever shade they could find near the helicopter, their flight suits already darkened with sweat patches despite the early afternoon hour. Rodriguez checked his watch impatiently. They were scheduled for a reconnaissance mission along the Pakistani border, a routine patrol that had become anything but routine as Taliban activity increased in the region. Every minute on the ground meant another minute of exposure, another opportunity for enemy mortar to find their range. Maria reached her fuel truck, a massive M978 A4 HEMTT tanker that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection. Vehicle's desert tan paint job was faded and chipped, and its fuel hoses were stained with the residue of thousands of refueling operations. She'd named the truck Esperanza, hope, after her mother's favorite word, painted in small letters, where only she could see them, just below the driver's side window. As she began her pre-fueling inspection, Maria's mind wandered to the letter she'd received the day before. Her grandmother, Rosa, had written from San Antonio with news from the old neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson's grandson had graduated from college. The corner store had finally installed air conditioning, and Father Miguel was planning a special mass for deployed military members. But it was the last paragraph that made Maria's heart ache with homesickness. Rosa had written about finding her mother's old prayer journal in a box of keepsakes, filled with names of soldiers Carmen had met during her hospital volunteer work years ago. She prayed for them every night, Mia, Rosa had written in her careful cursive. Even soldiers she met just once. Your mama believed every person in uniform was somebody's precious child, far from home, and needing extra protection from the Hamsi. Angels. Maria pulled the fuel hose from its housing, the familiar weight and texture grounding her in the present moment. The hose was 50 feet long and surprisingly heavy, designed to deliver JP-8 jet fuel at precisely controlled rates. She'd learned to handle it with the same expertise a musician handles their instrument, every connection perfect, every safety check thorough, every procedure followed to the letter. In her job, a single mistake could mean the difference between a successful mission and a catastrophic explosion. She approached the Black Hawk's fuel port, located behind the cockpit on the aircraft's right side. The crew watched her work with the casual attention of professionals who trusted each other implicitly. Rodriguez gave her a thumbs up from his position near the tail rotor, and she responded with a quick wave before focusing entirely on her task. The fuel nozzle clicked into place with a satisfying metallic sound, and Maria opened the valve to begin the flow of fuel. The gauge on her truck showed the black Hawk's tanks taking on fuel at the optimal rate, not too fast to cause dangerous pressure buildup, not too slow to delay the mission. This part of the job required patience and attention, but it also provided a few minutes of relative peace in an otherwise chaotic deployment. As the fuel flowed steadily into the helicopter's tanks, Maria found herself thinking about her mother. Carmen Gonzalez had been gone for 5 years now, lost to a cancer that had fought harder than any enemy Maria could imagine. But her mother's voice still lived in the songs and lullabies she'd taught her daughter, melodies that had traveled from Mexico to Texas and now to the mountains of Afghanistan. Without thinking, Maria began to hum softly, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise at the base. The melody was Aurora Mi Niño, a traditional Spanish lullaby that her great-grandmother had sung to her grandmother, who had sung it to her mother, who had sung it to her. It was a song about protection and love, about watching over children while they slept, about mothers who stood guard against the darkness. Aurora mi niño, aurora mi sol, aurora pedazo de mi corazón. The ancient words seemed to float on the desert air, mixing with the distant sounds of generators humming, radios crackling with communications, and the occasional roar of aircraft taking off from the runway. Maria's voice was clear and sweet, trained by years of singing in her church choir back home in San Antonio. She'd inherited her mother's gift for melody, along with her brown eyes, her stubborn streak, and her unshakable faith in the goodness of people. As she hummed, Maria checked the fuel flow gauge and noted the tank levels on her clipboard. Everything was proceeding perfectly, just another routine refueling operation in a deployment that had been thankfully routine so far. She had no way of knowing that her voice was carrying across the flight line, riding the hot desert wind past blast barriers and concrete bunkers, past guard towers and communication arrays, all the way to the operations center, where a man she'd never met was about to have his entire world turned upside down. The fuel tanks were nearly full now, and Maria could see Rodriguez beginning his pre-flight checks. Soon, this Black Hawk would lift off into the blazing Afghan sky, carrying its crew on another mission into uncertainty. But for this moment, there was peace in the simple act of keeping aircraft flying and soldiers safe, all while humming her mother's lullaby in a place where lullabies seemed impossible. She had no idea that somewhere in the distance, a clipboard was falling to the ground, and a man's hands were beginning to shake. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell adjusted his body armor for the third time in 10 minutes as he stood in the doorway of the Tactical Operations Center, surveying his domain with the practiced eye of a career military officer. At 45 years old, he commanded forward operating base Schenck with the kind of steady competence that came from 27 years of service, 3 combat deployments, and more close calls than he cared to remember. His graying temples, and the network of fine lines around his steel-gray eyes told the story of a man who had carried the weight of other people's lives for longer than most people had careers. The clipboard in his hands contained the afternoon mission briefings, routine reconnaissance flights, supply runs to outlying combat outposts, and medevac standby rotations that kept his aviation assets busy from dawn until well past dusk. Every mission mattered, every detail required his attention, and every decision could mean the difference between his soldiers coming home safely or not coming home at all. It was a responsibility that had aged him beyond his years, turning his once dark hair prematurely gray and giving him the kind of 1,000-yard stare that marked all veteran combat commanders. Mitchell had been reviewing the weather reports for the 3rd time when his aide, Captain Williams, had mentioned that the 159th Black Hawk was running behind schedule on refueling. Nothing unusual, their fuel operations always took longer than pilots wanted them to, and everyone was always in a hurry to get airborne and complete their missions before the heat became truly unbearable. But as the base commander, Mitchell made it his business to personally check on operations that ran behind schedule. In his experience, small delays often indicated larger problems, and larger problems had a way of cascading into disasters if left unattended. He stepped out of the air-conditioned comfort of the talk and into the blazing afternoon heat, feeling the familiar assault of desert air that seemed to suck the moisture from his lungs with every breath. The temperature differential was always jarring from the cool, controlled environment of the command center into the furnace-like atmosphere of the Afghan desert. His uniform, crisp and clean just minutes before, immediately began to show the effects of the heat and humidity. The base stretched out before him like a small city of tan and olive drab structures, surrounded by towering concrete T-walls and razor wire that glinted menacingly in the sun. Guard towers punctuated the perimeter. At regular intervals, their occupants barely visible as dark silhouettes against the bright sky. In the distance, the mountains of Paktika province rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks hazy in the desert air. Somewhere beyond those mountains lay Pakistan, and somewhere beyond that, the complex web of supply routes, safe houses, and training. Camps that kept the Taliban insurgency supplied with fighters, weapons, and the motivation to continue their war against the coalition forces. Mitchell had walked this route hundreds of times before, his boots following the same path from the operations center to the flight line that he'd worn smooth over 8 months of command. He knew every bunker, every building, every potential threat vector that surrounded his base. This knowledge wasn't academic, it was survival, the kind of intimate familiarity with terrain that kept commanders alive and their soldiers breathing. Every shadow could conceal a sniper. Every pile of debris could hide an improvised explosive device. And every local national worker could potentially be gathering intelligence for the enemy. As he approached the flight line, Mitchell's attention was focused entirely on the mission at hand. The Black Hawk crew was good, some of the best aviators he'd worked with, but even good crews made mistakes when they were rushed or distracted. Chief Warrant Officer Rodriguez was a 20-year veteran with over 3,000 flight hours. But he'd been pushing himself hard lately, volunteering for extra missions and spending his off-duty time writing letters home to his twin daughters. Stress of deployment affected everyone differently, and Mitchell had learned to watch for the subtle signs that indicated when his people were approaching their breaking point. The flight line buzzed with activity as usual. Maintenance crews worked on a Chinook helicopter nearby, their tools clanking against metal as they performed routine inspections. A fuel truck was parked next to the Black Hawk, its operator going through the standard refueling procedures with the methodical precision that marked all successful military operations. Radio chatter from the control tower mixed with the constant hum of generators and air conditioning units, creating the familiar symphony of a forward operating base in full operation. Mitchell was mentally preparing his conversation with Rodriguez, a gentle reminder about safety protocols and the importance of not rushing critical procedures when something stopped him dead in his tracks. It wasn't a sound he heard so much as a sound he felt, something that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and strike directly at his soul. A woman's voice, soft and melodic, was humming somewhere nearby. The melody was hauntingly familiar, a tune that seemed to rise from the deepest recesses of his memory like a ghost materializing from the desert heat. His footsteps slowed, then stopped entirely as his brain struggled to process what he was hearing. The tune was Spanish. He realized a lullaby, gentle and soothing, completely out of place in this harsh landscape of concrete and steel. Auroro, mi niño, auroro mi sol. The clipboard slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, hitting the concrete with a sharp crack that went unnoticed as Mitchell's entire world contracted to nothing but that voice. That melody, that impossible connection to a past he thought he'd buried decades ago. His hands began to tremble uncontrollably as the years collapsed around him like a house of cards. 28 years vanishing in an instant as he was transported back to a hospital room in San Antonio, Texas, where a young Latina woman with kind eyes and gentle hands had saved his life with nothing more than her presence and her voice. The rational part of his mind, the part trained by years of military discipline and combat experience, insisted that this was impossible. Coincidences like this didn't happen in real life. People from his past didn't materialize in the middle of Afghan deserts, humming the exact same lullaby that had pulled him back from the brink of despair when he was 17 years old and broken in ways that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. But his heart knew better. His heart recognized that voice with the same certainty that recognized his own name, his own reflection, his own soul. Somewhere in the shimmering heat waves rising from the flight line, the past had reached out to tap him on the shoulder and demand his attention. Mitchell stood frozen in the desert sun, a combat veteran reduced to a trembling teenager by the power of a woman's voice carrying an ancient lullaby across impossible distances and unimaginable years. Around him, the business of war continued unabated, but for James Mitchell, time had stopped completely. San Antonio, Texas, September 1984. The antiseptic smell of Brooke Army Medical Center hung in the air like a chemical fog, mixing with the underlying odors of human suffering, industrial-strength cleaning supplies, and the peculiar staleness that seemed to permeate every military hospital. Room 314 on the orthopedic ward had become 17-year-old James Mitchell's entire universe. Four pale green walls, a narrow window that looked out onto a parking lot, and a television mounted high in the corner that received exactly 3 channels when the weather cooperated. James lay motionless in the narrow hospital bed, his left leg suspended in traction, his right arm encased in a cast from shoulder to fingertip. The training accident at Fort Sam Houston had happened 6 weeks ago, but the memory remained crystal clear. The Humvee rolling down an embankment during night maneuvers, the sickening moment of weightlessness, then the crushing impact that had shattered bones and nearly claimed his life. He'd been lucky, the doctor said. Lucky to be alive, lucky to have all his limbs, lucky that his spinal cord remained intact. But lying alone in that sterile room day after day, James didn't feel lucky at all. His parents had made the trip from their small farm in rural Ohio exactly once. His father, a stern man weathered by decades of hard labor and financial struggle, had stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed for 20 minutes, shifting his weight from one worn work boot to the other, while struggling to find words that wouldn't come. His mother had wept silently, her rough hands clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers picked from their yard, flowers that had wilted and died within 2 days of her visit. They couldn't afford to stay, couldn't afford the time away from the farm, couldn't afford the hotel rooms and restaurant meals that would have allowed them to remain by their son's side during his recovery. "We'll pray for you, son," his father had said in his gravelly voice before they left. "You're stronger than you know." But James didn't feel strong. He felt broken in ways that had nothing to do with his shattered bones, abandoned by a world that seemed to have forgotten he existed, forgotten by friends who were busy with their senior year of high school, while he lay trapped in a hospital bed hundreds of miles from home. The days blurred together in an endless cycle of medications, physical therapy sessions, and long stretches of solitude that threatened to swallow him whole. The other patients in the ward were career soldiers, men with wives and children who filled their rooms with flowers, cards, and the warm noise of family life. James watched them through his doorway with a mixture of envy and despair, wondering what he'd done wrong to deserve such isolation. He'd enlisted in the Army Reserve straight out of high school, driven by a combination of patriotic idealism and the desperate need for the educational benefits that would allow him to escape the grinding poverty of his childhood. Instead, he'd found himself broken and alone, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. It was on a Tuesday morning, exactly 43 days after the accident, that Carmen Elena Gonzalez first appeared in his doorway like an angel dressed in hospital volunteer scrubs. She was 22 years old, with luminous dark eyes, thick black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. More remarkably, she carried a baby, a tiny girl with impossibly long eyelashes and her mother's dark eyes, sleeping peacefully in a blue cotton sling across Carmen's chest. "Excuse me," Carmen said, her voice carrying the soft accent of someone who'd grown up switching effortlessly between Spanish and English. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I'm Carmen, and this little one is Maria. I volunteer here a few hours each week, and I noticed you don't get many visitors. I thought maybe you'd like some company." James had stared at her in stunned silence, unable to process this sudden appearance of warmth and kindness in his sterile world. He'd grown so accustomed to solitude that the simple act of conversation seemed foreign, almost threatening. But Carmen had a gift for putting people at ease, a natural empathy that allowed her to see past his defensive walls to the scared, lonely teenager beneath. "I don't want to be any trouble," he'd finally managed, his voice rusty from disuse. "No trouble at all," Carmen had replied, settling into the vinyl chair beside his bed with practiced ease. "Besides, Maria here loves meeting new people, don't you, Mia?" She'd adjusted the sleeping baby with the unconscious grace of new motherhood, her movements gentle and sure. "I was just telling her we should make some new friends today." That first visit had lasted only 30 minutes, but it had changed everything. Carmen had talked easily about her life, her husband Roberto, who worked construction, her dreams of becoming a nurse, the tiny apartment they shared with her mother while they saved money for a house. She'd asked James about his home in Ohio, his family, his plans for the future with genuine interest that no one had shown him in weeks. When baby Maria had stirred and begun to fuss, Carmen had lifted her from the sling and begun to sing softly, her voice weaving a spell of comfort and peace that seemed to transform the sterile hospital room into something warmer, more human. "Aurora mi niño, aurora mi sol, aurora pedazo de mi corazón." The ancient Spanish lullaby had washed over James like a healing balm, its gentle melody and tender words speaking to something deep in his soul that had been crying out for exactly this kind of comfort. He'd never heard the song before, didn't understand the words, but he understood perfectly the love and protection it represented. For the first time since the accident, James had felt tears in his eyes, not tears of pain or despair, but tears of gratitude for this unexpected gift of human connection. Carmen had returned the next day, and the day after that, and every day, for the next 5 weeks. She'd brought books borrowed from the library, homemade tamales that put the hospital food to shame, and stories from the outside world that reminded James there was life beyond these walls. But most importantly, she'd brought her presence steady, warm, and utterly reliable in a way that allowed James to believe, for the first time in his life, that people could be trusted to stay, that kindness wasn't always conditional, that he was worthy of love simply because he existed. Carmen never spoke about her own struggles, the sleepless nights with a newborn, the financial pressures of supporting a young family, the exhaustion of juggling motherhood with volunteer work and part-time employment. She gave of herself freely, asking nothing in return except the simple pleasure of human connection and the satisfaction of knowing she was making a difference in someone's life. Years later, James would realize that those 5 weeks in room 314 had saved him in ways that went far beyond physical healing. Carmen Gonzalez had shown him what true service looked like, not the kind motivated by duty or obligation, but the kind that flowed naturally from a heart filled with compassion for others. She'd given him a model for the kind of person he wanted, to become the kind of leader he hoped to be, the kind of human being worthy of the second chance he'd been given. Forward Operating Base, Shank, Afghanistan. Present-day time moved differently in the moments after recognition. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell stood frozen on the sun-baked tarmac, his body trembling with a combination of desert heat and emotional shock that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained military composure. The rational part of his mind, the part that had been trained through decades of military service to analyze threats, assess situations, and make life or death decisions under pressure, screamed that this was impossible. Coincidences of this magnitude simply didn't happen in real life. The statistical probability of encountering the daughter of a woman who had changed his life 28 years ago, in a war zone 7,000 miles from where they'd first met, was so astronomical as to be essentially zero. But his heart knew better. His heart recognized the melody floating across the flight line with the same certainty that recognized his own heartbeat, his own breath, his own soul. The lullaby that had pulled him back from the brink of despair in a sterile hospital room was being hummed by a young woman in desert camouflage who couldn't possibly be old enough to remember him, couldn't possibly be connected to the angel who had saved his life when he was 17 and broken. Mitchell forced himself to move, his legs feeling like rubber as he took one tentative step, then another, toward the fuel station, where Staff Sergeant Gonzalez continued her work with professional efficiency. Each step brought him closer to a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face, a past he'd thought was buried beneath decades of military service and the accumulated weight of command responsibility. His hands shook as he walked, and he clenched them into fists to hide the tremor from the soldiers who might be watching their commanding officer's inexplicable behavior. As he approached, Mitchell could see the young woman more clearly. She was perhaps 28 years old, with the same dark eyes and olive skin tone he remembered from hospital visits that had taken place before she was even born. Her movements were precise and economical, the mark of someone who took pride in their work and understood that attention to detail could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She wore her uniform with the kind of quiet competence that marked the best non-commissioned officers, soldiers who formed the backbone of the military's operational capability. The fuel hose was nearly disconnected from the Black Hawk's tank when Mitchell finally found his voice. He cleared his throat, the sound harsh and strained in the desert air, and tried to project the kind of calm authority that had served him well throughout his career. But inside, his heart was hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. "Excuse me, Staff Sergeant," he called out, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard over the ambient noise of the flight line. The formality of military protocol provided a useful structure for approaching what promised to be the most emotionally charged conversation of his adult life. Maria looked up from her equipment checklist, her dark eyes widening slightly in surprise at finding the base commander standing beside her fuel truck. She immediately straightened to a position of respectful attention, her training overriding any curiosity about why the colonel would be personally visiting a routine refueling operation. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice clear and confident. Despite the obvious surprise at this unexpected encounter, there was something in her tone, a warmth beneath the military formality, that reminded Mitchell painfully of her mother's gentle manner of speaking. Mitchell studied her face intently, searching for familiar features in the shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile, the way she held her head when listening. The resemblance was there, subtle but unmistakable to someone who had spent countless hours memorizing every detail of Carmen Gonzalez's face during those crucial weeks of recovery. But more than physical features, There was something in Maria's demeanor, a natural empathy, a quiet strength, a way of making others feel immediately at ease that spoke of genetic inheritance far deeper than mere appearance. "Your name tape says Gonzalez," Mitchell continued, his voice carefully controlled despite the emotional earthquake occurring beneath his professional exterior. "Are you by any chance related to Carmen Gonzalez from San Antonio, Texas?" The question hung in the desert air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm of time and distance. Mitchell watched Maria's expression carefully, looking for any sign of recognition, any indication that this connection might be real, rather than a heat-induced hallucination brought on by too many months in the Afghan sun. Maria's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise, and Mitchell could see her mind working to process this unexpected personal question from her commanding officer. Her head tilted slightly to one side in a gesture that was so reminiscent of her mother that Mitchell felt his breath catch in his throat. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of curiosity mixed with a hint of protective caution, the natural wariness of someone whose family had been touched by the kind of tragedy that made unexpected questions about deceased relatives particularly painful. "Yes, sir," she replied slowly, her words measured and careful. "Carmen was my mother. She passed away 5 years ago from cancer." There was a slight tremor in her voice when she mentioned her mother's death, a barely perceptible crack in her professional composure that spoke of grief still not fully healed. "May I ask why you're asking, sir?" The confirmation hit Mitchell like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and threatening to buckle his knees. Carmen was gone. The woman who had saved his life, who had shown him what true compassion looked like, who had given him a model for the kind of person he wanted to become, was dead. The knowledge struck him with a grief that was both immediate and decades overdue, a mourning for someone he had never properly thanked, never had the chance to repay for her extraordinary kindness. But standing before him was Carmen's daughter, alive and strong, and serving her country with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her mother's volunteer work in a military hospital nearly 3 decades earlier. The circle was incomplete, but not broken. The thread of connection stretched across time and continents, but not severed. Mitchell's vision blurred as tears threatened to overwhelm him, and he struggled to maintain the composure expected of a senior military officer in front of his subordinates. His voice, when he finally found it, was thick with emotion barely held in check. "Staff Sergeant," he said, his words carrying the weight of 28 years of gratitude, regret, and wonder, "I have something very important to tell you about your mother. Something that I think she would have wanted you to know." Around them, the business of war continued unabated. Helicopters prepared for missions, soldiers went about their duties, and the great machinery of military operations maintained its relentless pace. But in the space between a fuel truck and a Black Hawk helicopter, time had collapsed entirely, bringing together past and present in a moment that would change both of their lives forever. Forward Operating Base Schenk, Afghanistan, present day. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the tarmac, but Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell barely felt its scorching heat as he reached into his left breast pocket with trembling fingers. His hands shook so violently that he nearly dropped his wallet twice before managing to extract it from beneath his body armor. The worn leather wallet had been his constant companion through 3 combat deployments, countless training exercises, and every significant moment of his military career. It contained the usual items: his military ID, credit cards, a few bills, photos of his parents' farm back in Ohio, but tucked behind everything else, protected by a small plastic sleeve, was something far more precious than any official document. Maria watched with growing concern as her commanding officer fumbled with his wallet, his normally steady hands betraying an emotional state that seemed completely at odds with his reputation as one of the most composed leaders on the base. She had heard stories about combat stress, about how even the strongest officers could sometimes crack under the relentless pressure of deployment, and she wondered if she was witnessing such a moment. The afternoon heat was brutal enough to cause hallucinations in soldiers who hadn't been properly hydrated, and Colonel Mitchell had been working non-stop for months without taking any significant time off. "Sir, are you feeling all right?" she asked gently, her voice carrying the same tone of caring concern that her mother had used when tending to patients at the hospital. "Maybe we should get you out of this sun. The heat index is approaching dangerous levels." But Mitchell wasn't hearing her words. His entire focus was concentrated on the small photograph he was extracting from his wallet with the reverence of someone handling a religious relic. The picture was faded and creased from years of being carried, its edges worn soft from countless handlings, its colors slightly bleached by time and exposure. But the image it contained was still clear enough to stop the world from turning. "This," Mitchell said, his voice breaking as he held the photograph toward Maria with hands that shook like autumn leaves, "is your mother holding you in 1984? She saved my life when I was 17 and broken, and I've carried this picture through every deployment, every battle, every moment of my career, looking for her." Maria's eyes widened as she stared at the photograph, her professional military composure cracking like ice under sudden pressure. The image showed a young Latina woman with luminous dark eyes and a radiant smile, holding a tiny baby in a soft blue blanket. Standing beside them, beaming with joy despite the cast on his arm and the hospital gown he wore, was an unmistakably younger version of the man standing before her. The photograph had been taken in what was clearly a hospital corridor, with medical equipment visible in the background and the kind of institutional lighting that characterized military medical facilities. "Oh my God," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the flight line. "Oh my God, that's really her. That's really my mother." Her hands flew to her mouth as if to catch the words before they escaped, but tears were already streaming down her cheeks, leaving dark tracks in the dust that coated her face from 8 months of desert deployment. The photograph trembled between them, a tangible bridge across 28 years of separation, loss, and longing. Mitchell's own tears fell freely now, his carefully maintained military bearing completely forgotten in the face of this impossible reunion. For a moment, neither of them could speak, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening between them. "She visited me every day for 6 weeks, Mitchell managed, his voice thick with emotion, as he struggled to find words adequate to describe what Carmen had meant to him. "I was alone, completely alone, with no family who could afford to stay with me, no friends, no hope. I was ready to give up on everything, on recovery, on the military, on life itself. And then your mother appeared like an angel, carrying you in that same blue blanket, and she refused to let me surrender to despair." Maria's tears came harder now, great gulping sobs that she tried unsuccessfully to suppress. Around them, other soldiers had begun to notice their commanding officer's unusual behavior, but something in the charged atmosphere of the moment kept them at a respectful distance. This was clearly a deeply personal moment, the kind of raw human experience that transcended military rank and protocol. "She sang to me," Mitchell continued, his voice growing stronger as the words poured out of him like water from a broken dam. "That same lullaby you were humming, Aurora mi niño, she sang it to both of us, to you and to me, every single day. Her voice was the first thing that made me believe I might actually survive, might actually have a future worth fighting. F.O.R. She never told me," Maria sobbed, pressing the heels of her palms against her eyes in a futile attempt to stem the flow of tears. "She never told me about you, about any of the soldiers she helped. I knew she volunteered at the hospital, but she never talked about specific people. She was so humble, so private about her service to others. Mitchell nodded, understanding flooding his features. That sounds exactly like her. She gave so much of herself, asked for nothing in return, never sought recognition or praise. She was the most genuinely selfless person I've ever met, and I spent the next 28 years trying to become worthy of the second chance she gave me. The photograph passed between them now, each taking turns to study its details with the intensity of archaeologists examining a precious artifact. Maria traced her finger gently over her mother's young face, remembering the stories Carmen had told about her early days as a new mother, the challenges of raising a baby while volunteering, and working part-time to support the family. Mitchell studied his own 17-year-old face, remembering the pain and hopelessness that had characterized those dark weeks before Carmen's intervention. I tried to find her, Mitchell said, his voice heavy with regret. Years later, after I commissioned as an officer, I went back to San Antonio, back to the hospital, trying to track her down so I could thank her properly. But she had moved, and there was no forwarding address, no way to trace her. I never stopped looking, never stopped hoping that someday I would have the chance to tell her what she meant to me. She would have been so proud, Maria whispered, looking at Mitchell with new understanding. She would have been so proud to know that she helped create the officer you became, the leader you are. She always said that soldiers were God's children, far from home and needing extra love and protection. As the reality of their connection settled over them both, soldiers throughout the immediate area found themselves witnesses to something extraordinary. Two people brought together by forces beyond coincidence, beyond explanation, beyond this normal boundaries of time and space. In a place defined by conflict and violence, where death was a constant companion and hope often seemed like a luxury few could afford, they were witnessing the power of love to transcend every obstacle, to bridge every gap, to heal wounds that had been carried for decades. Present day, the concrete barriers surrounding the flight line provided a small pocket of shade where Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell and Staff Sergeant Gonzalez had retreated to continue their extraordinary conversation away from the curious glances of passing soldiers. The intense Afghan sun still blazed overhead, but neither seemed to notice the brutal heat as they sat on empty ammunition crates, the faded photograph resting carefully between them like a sacred text being studied by devoted scholars. Maria wiped her tears with the back of her desert camouflage sleeve, leaving streaks of dust and salt across her cheeks. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached into her cargo pocket and withdrew a worn letter, the same one she'd received from her grandmother just the day before. The paper was already soft from repeated readings, creased from being folded and unfolded multiple times, as Maria had sought comfort in her abuela's familiar handwriting during the loneliness of deployment. My grandmother wrote to me yesterday, Maria said, her voice still thick with emotion, but growing stronger as she found her footing in this surreal conversation. She found something while cleaning out my mother's old room, a prayer journal that my mother kept for years after her volunteer work at the hospital. Rosa mentioned it contained names of soldiers my mother had met, soldiers she prayed for long after they'd recovered and moved on with their lives. Mitchell leaned forward intently, his gray eyes wide with interest and something that looked like desperate hope. What did she say about it? Did your grandmother mention any specific names? She didn't give me details in the letter, Maria replied, unfolding the delicate paper with careful hands. But she wrote something that made me think of you just now. Listen to this. Your mama kept a list of her hospital soldiers in a little blue notebook. She prayed for them every single night, Mia, even the ones she met just once. There was one boy in particular, a young man with sad eyes, who'd been hurt in some kind of accident. She worried about him for years, wondering if he'd found his way in life, if he'd discovered his purpose. Your mama believed that every person in uniform was somebody's precious child, far from home and needing extra protection from the angels. Mitchell's breath caught in his throat as he listened to the words, recognition flooding through him like electricity. A young man with sad eyes, he repeated softly. That was me. I was so lost, so broken, not just physically but spiritually. I felt like I'd been abandoned by the world, forgotten by God himself. And then your mother appeared and refused to let me disappear into that darkness. She never told me about specific people, Maria continued, her voice filled with wonder. At these revelations about her mother's hidden depths of compassion. Growing up, I knew she'd volunteered at the hospital, knew she'd worked with military patients, but she was so humble about it. She never made it sound like anything special, never talked about the individual soldiers she'd helped. She'd just say things like, I spent some time with the brave young men at the hospital today, but she never gave names or details. The conversation was interrupted briefly as a Chinook helicopter thundered overhead, its twin rotors beating the air with thunderous authority as it headed toward the landing zone with supplies from Bagram Airfield. Both soldiers instinctively paused until the noise subsided, a habit born from months of adapting conversations to the rhythm of military aviation operations. That was exactly like her, Mitchell said once the helicopter had passed. She gave so much of herself, but she never wanted recognition or praise. She acted like kindness was just a natural thing, like breathing or eating something you did automatically without thinking about it. But what she gave me was far from automatic. It was deliberate, sustained, sacrificial love from someone who had every reason to focus on her own challenges instead. Maria nodded, fresh tears gathering in her eyes as she began to understand the full scope of her mother's impact. She was struggling too, you know. My father was working construction then, barely making enough to support us. They were living with my grandmother in a tiny apartment, saving every penny they could for a place of their own. She was exhausted, from taking care of a newborn, from the sleepless nights and constant worry that comes with new motherhood. But she still found time and energy to care for strangers. I had no idea, Mitchell said, his voice heavy with newfound understanding and regret. She never let on that she was dealing with her own hardships. To me, she seemed like she had everything figured out, like she was this incredibly strong, confident woman who had found her purpose in life. She made caring for others look effortless. That was her gift, Maria explained, a sad smile crossing her face as she remembered her mother's unwavering strength. She could carry the weight of the world on her shoulders and still make everyone around her feel like they were the most important person in the room. Even when she was diagnosed with cancer, even during the worst of her treatments, she was more concerned about how her illness was affecting the rest of us than she was about her own pain. Mitchell shook his head in amazement. She shaped everything. About the officer I became, the leader I tried to be. Every time I had to counsel a young soldier, every time I saw someone struggling with loneliness or despair, I thought about your mother's example. I asked myself what Carmen would do, how she would approach the situation. She became my model for servant leadership, for what it really means to put others before yourself. She joined military family support groups after her hospital volunteer work ended. Maria continued, eager to share more of her mother's hidden legacy. She organized care package drives for deployed soldiers, even families she'd never met. She'd spend hours at the grocery store, carefully selecting items for the packages, reading the labels to make sure she was sending the best of everything. She treated those packages like she was packing for her own children. And that's why you enlisted, Mitchell said, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. You were following in her footsteps, continuing her mission of caring for service members. Maria nodded, her voice thick with emotion. I joined the Army 6 months after she died. I felt this overwhelming need to honor her memory, to continue the work she'd started. She'd always spoken so proudly of the soldiers she'd met, talked about their courage and sacrifice with such reverence. She instilled in me this deep respect for military service, this understanding that soldiers are people's sons and daughters, husbands and wives far from home and deserving of every kindness we can show them. "She would be so proud of you," Mitchell said, his voice filled with absolute certainty. "Not just because you followed her example of service, but because you became exactly the kind of person she raised you to be, someone who sees the humanity in others, someone who understands that small acts of kindness can literally save lives." As the sun began its slow descent toward the mountains of Paktika province, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossible in such a harsh landscape, both soldiers sat in comfortable silence, processing the magnitude of what they'd discovered about their connection and about the woman whose love had brought them together across impossible distances and decades of separation. News traveled fast on a military base, especially news as extraordinary as what had unfolded on the flight line that afternoon. By evening chow, whispered conversations filled the dining facility as soldiers shared fragments of the impossible story they'd witnessed. Their commanding officer, the stoic Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, who never showed emotion, had been seen crying openly with Staff Sergeant Gonzalez over a faded photograph. The details varied depending on who was telling the story, but the central truth remained consistent. Something miraculous had happened between two people who should have been strangers. Captain Sarah Williams, Mitchell's aide-de-camp, had been the first to approach him after witnessing the emotional encounter from a distance. She'd served under Mitchell for 18 months and had never seen him display anything beyond professional concern for his soldiers. The sight of her commanding officer weeping on the tarmac had initially alarmed her, triggering thoughts of combat stress and the invisible wounds that claimed even the strongest leaders. But when she'd gotten close enough to hear fragments of their conversation, she'd realized she was witnessing something far different, something that transcended the normal boundaries of military life. "Sir," she'd said carefully, approaching, with the hesitant respect of someone unsure whether they were intruding on a private moment, "is there anything you need? Any way I can assist?" Mitchell had looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes that somehow seemed clearer and brighter than she'd ever seen them. "Captain Williams," he'd said, his voice thick with emotion but steady with purpose, "I need you to help me arrange something very special. Something that I think will matter to everyone on this base." Word spread through the informal networks that connected every military unit, the web of friendships, shared duties, and common experiences that allowed information to flow faster than any official communication system. By the time the sun had set behind the mountains of Paktika province, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, soldiers throughout forward operating base Schenk were gathering in small groups to discuss the story that was already becoming legend. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the crew chief from the Black Hawk that Maria had been refueling, was among the first to share his perspective with anyone willing to listen. "I'm telling you, man," he said to a circle of mechanics and fuel handlers gathered around a concrete picnic table near the motor pool, "I've never seen anything like it." The colonel was shaking like he'd seen a ghost, and Gonzalez was crying like her heart was breaking and healing at the same time. Whatever happened between them, it was bigger than anything I've ever witnessed in 15 years of service. The story grew and evolved with each telling, but rather than becoming distorted, it seemed to gain emotional weight and significance as soldiers added their own experiences of unexpected kindness, their own memories of strangers who had changed their lives in profound ways. Sergeant First Class Michael Thompson, a medic from Tennessee, shared the story of a gas station attendant in Atlanta who had paid for his meal when he was traveling to his first deployment with no money and no family to see him off. Private Jessica Chun told about an elderly woman at Dallas Airport who had quietly upgraded her ticket to first class and left a note thanking her for her service. "It's like there are angels everywhere," said Specialist Marcus Washington, a 19-year-old communications specialist from Detroit who was on his first deployment. "People who show up exactly when you need them most, who do things that change your whole life, and then they disappear before you can even thank them properly." As the evening progressed, Mitchell made his way through the base with Maria at his side, their unlikely partnership drawing curious but respectful attention from soldiers who had heard various versions of their story. They visited each major section of the base, the maintenance hangars where aircraft mechanics worked through the night to keep helicopters flying, the communications center where operators maintained contact with units throughout the region, the medical facility where combat medics and nurses tended to both routine ailments and the tragic results of enemy action. At each stop, Mitchell shared the basic outline of their story, always with Maria's permission, always with deep respect for the privacy of their emotions. But he also asked each group of soldiers to share their own stories of unexpected kindness, their own encounters with strangers who had made a difference in their lives. The responses were immediate and heartfelt, creating an impromptu oral history of human compassion that seemed to transform the entire atmosphere of the base. In the communications center, Sergeant Patricia Valdez told about the Red Cross volunteer who had sat with her a 14-hour flight delay when she was traveling to her father's funeral. Staff Sergeant James O'Connor shared the story of his high school teacher who had driven across 3 states to attend his basic training graduation when his own family couldn't make the trip. Each story seemed to unlock another memory, another instance of grace that had touched lives in ways both small and profound. "It's like your mother started something," Captain Williams observed to Maria as they sat in the base chapel later that evening, surrounded by soldiers who had continued to gather as word of their story spread. Something that rippled out from that hospital room in 1984 and has been growing ever since. The base chaplain, Major David Foster, had requested an impromptu gathering in the small chapel that served all denominations and faiths represented among the deployed soldiers. The building was little more than a reinforced concrete structure with wooden benches and a simple altar, but it had become a sacred space where soldiers sought comfort, guidance, and connection with something larger than the immediate realities of war. "What we've witnessed today," Chaplain Foster said to the assembled soldiers, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had counseled countless military members through their darkest moments, "is proof that love transcends every boundary we think exists. Time, distance, death itself, none of these things are strong enough to break the bonds created by genuine compassion and service to others." Mitchell arranged for a secure video call to San Antonio using the base's official communications equipment to connect with Maria's 78-year-old grandmother, Rosa Gonzalez. The elderly woman's face appeared on the screen in the communications center, surrounded by family members who had gathered in her small living room to witness this extraordinary moment. When Rosa saw Mitchell's face beside her granddaughter's, her weathered hands flew to her mouth in recognition and wonder. "Little Jimmy," she whispered in accented English, tears streaming down her face. "My Carmen's little Jimmy. She prayed for you every night until the day she died. She never forgot her sad boy with the broken bones and the sadder heart." The conversation lasted nearly an hour, bridging not just the physical distance between Afghanistan and Texas, but the emotional chasm created by years of separation and loss. Rosa shared stories about Carmen that neither Mitchell nor Maria had heard before, stories about late-night prayers, about care packages sent to addresses gathered from military family networks, about a woman who had turned her own grief and struggle into fuel for serving others. As the evening drew to a close, soldiers throughout Forward Operating Base Schenck found themselves profoundly changed by the day's events. The story of Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell and Staff Sergeant Gonzalez had become more than just an extraordinary coincidence. It had become a reminder of the invisible threads that connected all their lives, the unexpected ways that kindness could survive and flourish even in the harshest environments, and the truth that no act of love, no matter how small, ever truly dies. 6 months later, Fort Sam Houston, San Antonio, Texas, the same Texas sun that had blazed mercilessly over the deserts of Afghanistan, now cast gentle morning light through the stained glass windows of the Fort Sam Houston Chapel, transforming the simple military sanctuary into something ethereal and sacred. The chapel was filled to capacity with an unusual mixture of military personnel, family members, and civilians who had come to witness what many were calling the most extraordinary commissioning ceremony in the history of the post. Second Lieutenant Maria Elena Gonzalez stood at attention before the altar, her new officer's uniform pristine and sharply pressed, the gold bars on her shoulders gleaming in the morning light. At 29 years old, she had completed officer candidate school with the kind of distinction that marked natural leaders, earning the respect of instructors and fellow candidates, who had quickly recognized her innate ability to inspire others through quiet competence and genuine care. In the front row sat Rosa Gonzalez, Maria's 78-year-old grandmother, wearing her finest dress and a small silver cross that had belonged to Carmen. Beside her were Maria's extended family, aunts, uncles, and cousins who had driven from across Texas to witness this moment. But it was the figure standing at the front of the chapel, waiting to present Maria's commission, that made this ceremony unlike any other. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, resplendent in his dress blue uniform, with the ribbons and decorations earned through 3 decades of distinguished service, held a small wooden box containing the lieutenant's bars that would formally mark Maria's transition from enlisted soldier to commissioned officer. But more than the symbols of rank, he carried the weight of a promise made in the desert heat of Afghanistan, a promise to honor Carmen's memory by ensuring her daughter had every opportunity to fulfill her potential as a leader. The ceremony began with the traditional elements, the invocation by Chaplain Foster, who had flown in from Afghanistan specifically for this occasion, the reading of Maria's commission, signed by the President of the United States, and the formal administration of the officer's oath. But when the moment came for Mitchell to present the lieutenant's bars, he paused and addressed the assembled congregation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "what you are witnessing today is more than the commissioning of a fine new officer. You are witnessing the completion of a circle that began 28 years ago in this very city, when a young woman named Carmen Gonzalez chose to show extraordinary kindness to a broken 17-year-old soldier who had lost all hope." Mitchell's words carried clearly through the chapel's acoustic system, reaching every person in the packed sanctuary. He told the story, abbreviated but complete, of Carmen's impact on his life, of the lullaby that had saved his soul, of the impossible reunion in Afghanistan that had revealed the depth and breadth of one woman's legacy of service. "Carmen Gonzalez never sought recognition or praise," Mitchell continued, his eyes finding Rosa's face in the front row. "She simply saw people in need and responded with love. She taught me what true service looks like, not service motivated by duty or obligation, but service that flows naturally from a heart filled with compassion for others. Today, as I commission her daughter as an officer in the United States Army, I am not just fulfilling a professional responsibility. I am completing a sacred duty to honor a woman who saved my life and shaped my soul." As Mitchell approached Maria to pin on her lieutenant's bars, the chapel fell into complete silence. The simple gold bars seemed to carry the weight of generations, representing not just Maria's achievement, but the culmination of her mother's influence, extending across decades and continents. Mitchell's hands were steady as he attached the symbols of her new rank, but his voice trembled slightly as he spoke the traditional words. "By the authority vested in me by the President of the United States, I commission you as a second lieutenant in the United States Army." But then he departed from tradition, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small gift wrapped in tissue paper. "This is from your mother," he said softly, loud enough for only Maria to hear. "I've carried it with me for 28 years, waiting for the right moment to pass it on." Maria unwrapped the tissue paper with trembling fingers, revealing a small silver medal depicting Saint Christopher, the patron saint of travelers. It was tarnished with age and wear, clearly beloved and frequently handled. On the reverse side, engraved in delicate script, were the words, "Para mi soldado valiente," for my brave soldier. "She gave this to me the day I was discharged from the hospital," Mitchell explained, his voice thick with emotion. "She said it would keep me safe on all my journeys. It has traveled with me through 3 combat deployments, through every challenge and triumph of my career. But I always knew it was meant to find its way back to her family eventually." Tears streamed down Maria's face as she held the small medal, feeling the warmth of her mother's love transmitted across time through this simple piece of silver. Around them, there wasn't a dry eye in the chapel, as the assembled witnesses understood. They were seeing something far more profound than a routine military ceremony. Following the formal conclusion of the commissioning, the reception held in the chapel's fellowship hall became an impromptu celebration of service and sacrifice. Maria had established the Carmen's Angels program during her time at Officer Candidate School, organizing care packages and support networks for military families facing deployment. The program had already expanded beyond her initial vision, with volunteers from multiple states contributing time, resources, and love to continue Carmen's legacy of caring for soldiers far from home. Representatives from the program were present at the reception, sharing stories of families they had helped, soldiers they had supported, and the ripple effects of kindness that continued to spread outward from Carmen's original example. A young private from California talked about receiving a care package during his first deployment to Iraq, describing how the handwritten note from a stranger had given him strength during his darkest moments. A military spouse from Georgia shared how the program had provided emergency assistance when her husband was wounded in action, connecting her with resources and support that had literally saved her family. As the afternoon drew to a close, Mitchell and Maria found themselves standing in the same hospital corridor where the original photograph had been taken 28 years earlier. The building had been renovated multiple times since 1984, but the basic structure remained the same. They stood in the spot where Carmen had once comforted a broken teenager, where she had sung lullabies to her infant daughter, where love had first bridged the gap between strangers and created bonds that would endure across decades. "She's here," Maria said softly, clutching the St. Christopher medal that had found its way home at last. "I can feel her presence, her approval, her love surrounding us." Mitchell nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Carmen Gonzalez had been gone for 5 years, but her influence continued to grow and spread like ripples on an endless pond. Through Maria's service, through the Carmen's Angels program, through the countless lives touched by their story in Afghanistan and beyond, her legacy of love had achieved a kind of immortality. As the sun set over San Antonio, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to bless their reunion, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell and Second Lieutenant Gonzalez stood together in grateful silence, knowing that somewhere in the space between earth and heaven, an angel was smiling at the completion of a circle that had taken 3 decades and 7,000 miles to close. The lullaby of love had found its way home at last.